I didn't expect the question. Not from him. Not like that. We had finished dinner late. It was one of those evenings where everything felt calm but distant, as if the day had passed over us without touching either of our skins. The lights were dim. The dishes were still in the sink. I was pouring tea. He was sitting back, arms crossed, gaze low. And then he said it. "I've been thinking about something. For a while." I looked at him. He didn't meet my eyes. That was the first sign it was serious. "What is it?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "There's something I want. Something I've thought about for a long time." I blinked. Waited. I could hear the teacup ticking against the counter from where I had set it. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. "I want to see you. With someone else." The silence that followed was full and total, like a vacuum. I thought I misunderstood. I laughed. A short, confused sound. He didn't laugh back. My hands had stilled on the counter. I turned slowly. "What?" His eyes met mine now. Steady. Not someone random. Not anything reckless. Just another woman. With me. Watching. Together. My breath caught. A strange heat rose up through my spine, not from excitement, from shock. From the breaking of something I didn't know was fragile. I set down the spoon I was holding. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything now. I just needed to tell you that I've thought about it." He stood then, kissed my forehead lightly, as if he hadn't just set fire to something between us. And then he went upstairs. I didn't follow. I sat at the kitchen table in silence, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the far-off ticking of a clock I never noticed before. The next day, he didn't bring it up. Neither did I. We lived as usual. He went to work. I moved through my day like a person on autopilot. Made the bed, answered emails, folded laundry. But every task felt distant, like I was watching myself perform it from behind glass. I couldn't stop hearing the words, "I want to see you. With someone else." They echoed when I rinsed dishes, when I sat in the car, when I walked past the mirror. I'd never considered it before. Not the possibility. Not even the fantasy. I thought I knew myself well enough to say what I would never want. But something had cracked open. I tried to push the thought away, to close that door. But the door, once opened, refused to shut. That night, I watched him sleep. He looked peaceful, familiar. The man I'd shared a home with for years. His breathing was slow, steady, his arm across his chest. He didn't know that I was lying there, completely awake, wide-eyed in the dark. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket higher. My body wasn't tense. It wasn't relaxed either. It was something else. As if my skin itself remembered something I hadn't given it permission to remember. I hated that I felt anything, but I did. I tried to tell myself it was just the shock, that it would pass, that I didn't want this. But what frightened me most was that I couldn't say I didn't. The following week passed slowly. He acted as though nothing had happened. He kissed me on the cheek in the mornings, asked what I wanted for dinner, made plans for the weekend. I responded like a woman who was fine. But inside, I was unsettled. Not angry, not betrayed. Just shaken. I found myself distracted at the most ordinary moments, reading the same sentence over again in a book, forgetting why I'd walked into a room. I had dreams too, not explicit, but strange, of being watched, of moving slowly through rooms I didn't recognize, with someone's breath warm behind me, but never touching. And always his voice, low, steady, somewhere just out of reach. One night, 2 weeks later, I asked. We were brushing our teeth. "Do you still think about it?" He looked at me in the mirror. Swallowed. "Every day," he said. I turned off the water. "I'm not saying yes," I said quietly. "But I'm not saying no either." He said nothing, just nodded. That night, he held me differently, as if something inside him had shifted. And maybe something in me had too. I didn't bring it up again. Not for days. But I felt it moving under the surface of everything. The mornings had a strange tension now, not conflict, not coldness. Just something suspended, like a string stretched tight between us. When he kissed my temple before work, I felt it. When I set his coffee down at the table, I felt it. Even in the silence of brushing our teeth, I felt it. That lingering question neither of us dared to name again too soon. And still, I couldn't stop thinking. I found myself observing people differently. Watching the way women carried themselves, the curve of a shoulder, the slope of a neck, the softness in the way one tucked her hair behind her ear at a cafe. I wasn't comparing, not really. I was curious. What did he see? What did he imagine? And why, despite myself, was I trying to understand it? I felt like a woman walking barefoot through water, testing the depth one step at a time. Each thought, each image, each breath, a quiet ripple. It wasn't arousal. Not yet. It was something quieter. Something more dangerous. Permission. He still didn't ask again. I half expected him to, but he didn't. And I realized that made it worse. That silence told me he had already imagined it enough times that he no longer needed to voice it. He had put it in my hands, and now he waited. I noticed how careful he was with me. He didn't press, but he watched, and I couldn't ignore the way my body reacted to that. The way his gaze seemed to trace more than just lines across my skin. The way I leaned slightly toward him when he passed behind me. The way my breath caught when he stood a little too close in the hallway. Everything meant more now, and none of it was spoken aloud. In the grocery store, I caught myself brushing my fingers across the glass of a bottle, not because I was reading the label, but because it felt good to slow down, to feel something. At home, I lingered in front of the mirror longer, not to admire, not to judge, but to see myself. Really see. The way he might. The way she might. I realized how rarely I had done that. I had become so functional, so practiced in being useful, capable, stable, that I had forgotten I was also a person with skin and breath and a quiet, steady hunger to be seen without being expected to explain. The dream started after that. I didn't tell him. Not because they were graphic. They weren't. But because they unsettled me in ways I didn't know how to say. Sometimes I was standing in a doorway. Sometimes she was. I never saw her face, not fully. But I knew it was her. The woman who didn't yet exist. Who somehow had already touched me. I would feel breath on my collarbone. A hand at the back of my neck. Not heavy. Not rough. Just a quiet knowing that undid me with gentleness. And always, I would wake up before anything began. My heart racing, my chest warm. I would stare into the dark, not moving. I never woke him. One night, I sat alone in the kitchen. The house was asleep. The clock ticked. The moonlight cast a silver stripe across the floor. I had a cup of tea in my hands. It had gone cold. And suddenly I thought, what if this wasn't about fantasy? What if it was about something deeper? A surrender? A permission I'd never granted myself? What if it wasn't about her at all, but about me, about the part of me I had kept quiet for too long? I didn't need another person to awaken me. I just needed to stop being afraid of myself. The next morning, I woke before him. I laid there in the half-dark, the blankets warm around me, his breath steady. I turned my head, studied the shape of his face in sleep. There was something boyish about him when he dreamed. The faint crease between his brows, the way his mouth softened. I reached out, touched his shoulder. He stirred, opened one eye, then both. Smiled. My voice was quiet. Can you be home by 8 tonight? He blinked. Tonight? I nodded. Don't ask why. Just trust me. His eyes searched mine, but he didn't question. He only said, I'll be here. The day moved in a blur. My hands felt steady, but inside, something pulsed. Not fear, not guilt, just breathless certainty. Every step I took felt heavier, every detail more vivid. The sound of the kettle boiling, the touch of fabric against my skin, the stillness of the house before dusk. And then it was time. He came home as promised. Jacket off, shoes at the door. A slight tension in his eyes that said he knew something was different even if he didn't yet know what. I didn't greet him with words. I took his hand. He followed. Down the hall, past the kitchen, to the room I had prepared. The door was already slightly ajar. Soft light spilled out, and she was already there, seated calmly, composed, not smiling, just present. She didn't speak. Neither did I. Neither did he. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then it wasn't. It was sacred. She stood. Her eyes moved from him to me. And then she stepped forward. She didn't rush. She reached for my wrist with a quiet, steady hand. Just a touch, barely a graze. And still, it felt like a match to dry paper. I turned toward her, not away. And in that moment, I forgot everything that had come before. He was behind me, watching, breathing, not apart from it, not controlling it, just there, a part of the air itself. When her fingers moved again, tracing a slow line up my arm, I didn't flinch. I felt warmth spread beneath my skin. Not heat, not fire, just presence. She stepped closer, and I closed my eyes. The air between us was alive. He didn't speak. He didn't move, but I could feel him, as if his breath had found its own rhythm with mine. And in that moment, without anything more than stillness and touch, I realized this was not the crossing of a line. It was the opening of a door I had locked from the inside. The silence afterward was not emptiness. It was saturation. Every corner of the house felt heavier the next morning, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what we hadn't dared to say out loud. I woke before him again, my body still humming with the memory of movement, breath, heat, but it wasn't about the memory. It was about everything I couldn't name now. I stood at the sink rinsing a cup, the light barely touching the counter. My hands moved by instinct, but my mind had stopped following routine. It lingered on how his eyes had locked on mine and hadn't looked away. On how her hand had moved without hesitation, without question. On how none of us had spoken, and yet everything had been said. He came down the stairs slowly, like he wasn't sure what time meant anymore. His eyes met mine with that same steady calm, but I saw it, the fracture beneath it, the knowledge that something had shifted between us, that we had crossed into territory we could no longer pretend didn't exist. "Morning," he said, his voice careful. I nodded. "Morning." We didn't say anything else. He kissed my cheek gently before taking his seat, and I felt the warmth of it trail behind long after his lips left my skin. That afternoon, I met a friend for lunch. I wore a soft scarf around my neck, the same one I used to wear when I wanted to feel graceful. I hadn't reached for it in months. She asked me how I was. I smiled and gave her all the right answers. Fine. Busy. A little tired. I told her about a new book I'd started reading. About a recipe I wanted to try. About a show we'd watched the other night, though I couldn't remember which one. I didn't tell her that I had stepped out of myself and come back someone else. I didn't tell her that my hands felt different now, as if they'd been held in a new way, one I hadn't known I needed. That night, he didn't touch me. Not out of distance. Out of reverence. We lay side by side, the air between us warm and alive, but still. I turned my head toward him in the dark. His eyes were open. "Do you regret it?" I whispered. His breath caught. Then, no. And then, do you? I closed my eyes. No. We didn't speak after that. But he reached for my hand. And I let him. Days passed, but they didn't feel like ordinary time. We became careful again. But not from shame. From awe. I moved through the house with new awareness of space, of quiet, of the way my own voice sounded when I spoke. I was softer now. And sharper. I could feel everything. I caught myself remembering details I didn't know I had taken in. The texture of her sleeve. The exact pressure of her fingers. The flicker of his breath when she touched me. And I began to wonder if I would ever stop remembering. It changed how I looked at him. Not just because he had wanted this, but because of how he watched me, not like a man who had received something, but like one who had been changed by it. He started pausing more when he passed by, touching my elbow lightly, pressing his lips to my shoulder longer than usual. Not in urgency, but in worship. I didn't recognize this version of him, but I liked it, and I was terrified of it. One morning, a message arrived. Not from her, we hadn't spoken since, but from someone else. A friend of his. A name I knew but barely. He had seen something in us, he said. The way we moved near each other at a dinner. The way we had touched. He had felt it, that something had opened. And he wanted to be near it too. I didn't respond. I deleted the message. But I told him. He read it in silence, then set the phone down. Do you want to? He asked. I shook my head. No. Not yet. He didn't ask what yet meant. But we both felt it. We were no longer hiding. But we were not telling the truth either. I found myself lying to people without meaning to. Saying we were doing fine. That things were the same. When the truth was, things were so different, I no longer knew how to describe them. We went out to dinner one night, and I felt eyes on me in a new way. Not because of what I wore. Not because of how I looked. But because I was carrying something unspoken in my spine. A woman who had been undone and reborn in the space between two hands and the quiet breath of someone who had given her back to herself. The final moment of the week came quietly. I found myself in front of the mirror again. No makeup. No fixing. Just me. I looked. And I didn't turn away. I placed my palm against the glass, not to test the reflection, but to meet it. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a woman preparing to be chosen. I saw someone who had already chosen herself. And that, more than anything, was the most dangerous lie I had ever lived without. The morning it all ended felt like any other. But the air was different. I woke alone. He had already gone for a walk, a new habit he'd taken up in recent weeks. I stayed in bed longer than usual, eyes open, tracing the shape of sunlight on the ceiling. There was no urgency, no need to move, because I knew something had finished turning inside me during the night. The house was quiet, but not heavy. I got up, wrapped myself in a robe, and stepped barefoot into the hall. Every step echoed a little longer than usual, as if the walls were listening. As if they, too, knew. I passed the guest room. It was empty. Not physically. But the memory of that night had drained from the space. Not vanished, only integrated. It no longer pulsed like a secret. It simply lived here now, like part of the floorboards. At breakfast, he sat across from me, his hands wrapped around a mug. He looked at me with something quieter than love, but deeper. Gratitude. Or reverence. He said, "You look like someone who slept without apology." I smiled. I did. He didn't ask for more. And I didn't offer. Because what we had crossed through didn't require retelling. Only recognition. Over the next days, we were different. Not dramatic. Not louder. Just more ourselves. He touched me more. Not in want. In acknowledgement. I touched him back. Not in performance. In presence. We began to speak less and mean more. I think that's how healing happens. Not in proclamations. But in the pauses where nothing is said and yet everything has shifted. One afternoon, I stood in the middle of the garden with a book in my hands, unopened. The wind moved through the leaves above me. My dress fluttered against my calves. I could feel the sun on the back of my neck. I looked up. Not at anything. Just up. And I whispered to no one. I'm here. Because I was. And I hadn't been, not really, in a long time. That night, we lay side by side, not touching, but tethered by something invisible. He turned to me. You were brave, he said. I turned too. I was scared. He nodded. Sometimes they're the same thing. We didn't kiss, but our foreheads touched. And it was enough. Weeks passed. We didn't repeat it. We didn't need to. The experience wasn't about replication. It was about revelation. I saw myself clearer now. Not as a woman in a marriage. Not as a performer in someone's dream. But as someone who had stepped to the edge of a silence she didn't know was hers and returned with a voice she hadn't realized she'd buried. I was quieter now, but not because I had less to say. Because I no longer needed anyone else's echo to feel real. I began writing again. Nothing structured. Just fragments. Lines scribbled in the margins of receipts. In notebooks beside the bed. Phrases that rose in me like mist and refused to dissipate until I caught them. I wrote things like, the skin forgets nothing. Not even what it was denied. Stillness is not the absence of feeling. It is the saturation of it. To be watched is one thing. To be seen is another. To be witnessed and not wither. That is the beginning of truth. One morning, he brought me coffee and said, Do you miss it? I looked at him. Miss what? He shrugged. The edge. That moment. I thought about it. And I said no. Not because it hadn't mattered, but because it had done what it came to do. It had returned me to myself. Sometimes we live lives wrapped in layers of assumption roles, rules, habits. And then, something cracks. Sometimes it's a question whispered over tea. Sometimes it's a hand where you didn't expect one. Sometimes it's the look in someone's eyes that says, I've dreamed of this and I need you to know. And when that moment comes, we either retreat into the safety of who we were, or we risk becoming something else. I didn't lose anything. I didn't betray anyone. I became. And that was the most radical thing of all. Now, when I sit at the window with my tea, I think of her. The woman I was before. And I thank her. For being patient. For waiting. For whispering. Every night I turned away from myself. You don't have to stay asleep. This is not the story of a scandal. It's the story of a return. To breath. To silence. To the woman who finally said yes, not to anyone else, but to herself.